Look, I'm just a regular guy who works for the University Extension Service helping families grow food in Arizona heat. My wife and I have 2 kids, and we wanted to make sure we could provide fresh vegetables year-round despite increasingly extreme temperatures. What I didn't expect was our HOA president demanding I remove my greenhouse because it looked too commercial for a residential neighborhood. 8 months later, when record temperatures hit 118 degrees Fahrenheit and every garden in our community was completely dead, except mine, Karen learned the hard way that climate adaptation isn't about looking professional. It's about feeding your family when traditional growing methods fail. But wait until you hear what happened when the most severe heat wave in Arizona history exposed not just the failure of Karen's aesthetic priorities, but also her scheme to profit from community landscaping contracts while blocking residents from developing food security that could have saved families thousands during the supply crisis. What would you do if someone tried to stop you from growing your own food during a climate emergency? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I bet your area is dealing with extreme weather challenges too. If you love seeing justice served when practical preparation beats aesthetic obsession, hit that subscribe button for more stories where common sense wins over HOA tyranny. Picture this. It's a typical Saturday morning in Desert Vista, Arizona, and I'm checking the climate controls in my backyard greenhouse before the day gets too hot. The smell of fresh basil and tomato plants fills the humid air as I inspect the automated irrigation, temperature regulation, and ventilation systems that keep our food production running despite Arizona's increasingly extreme temperatures. I'm David Park, 42 years old, and I work as a sustainable agriculture specialist for the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension. My wife Maria manages our local food bank, and we have 2 kids, Sophia, 13, and Carlos, 10. We're regular folks trying to make it work in Arizona, where grocery costs keep rising and extreme heat makes traditional gardening impossible for most of the year. The greenhouse in our backyard isn't anything fancy, just a 12 by 20 climate-controlled structure with automated systems that maintain optimal growing conditions year-round. During Arizona's brutal summers, when temperatures regularly exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit, this greenhouse produces about 200 pounds of fresh vegetables monthly that saves our family roughly $400 on grocery costs while providing food security during supply disruptions. This morning's inspection showed exactly what I hoped to see: healthy tomato plants heavy with fruit, lettuce growing in hydroponic towers, and herbs thriving in conditions that would kill traditional outdoor gardens. We were ready for another month of Arizona heat with reliable food production. That peaceful morning routine was shattered by the aggressive sound of heels clicking across our concrete patio and a voice that carried the particular authority of someone who'd clearly been building up to a confrontation for weeks. "David!" Karen Martinez called out as she marched toward my greenhouse carrying a folder and wearing the kind of determined expression that meant someone was about to have their day ruined. "We need to discuss your agricultural operations situation." Karen Martinez was 48 years old, a landscape design consultant who'd moved to Arizona from California 2 years ago. She drove a white Range Rover that was always spotless, lived in the biggest house in our neighborhood, and had somehow gotten herself elected HOA president despite understanding absolutely nothing about Arizona growing conditions or food security. "Morning, Karen," I replied, setting down my pH testing kit and preparing for what I figured would be another complaint about something completely reasonable that she'd decided was a problem. "I've been getting complaints from neighbors," Karen announced, opening her folder with the satisfaction of someone who'd been collecting evidence. "Your commercial greenhouse operation is creating an industrial appearance that's affecting property values, and several residents are concerned about zoning violations and safety hazards." I looked at her for a moment, trying to process the phrase commercial operation being applied to basic food production during the worst heat conditions in Arizona history. We were living in a state where outdoor gardening was impossible during summer months, where grocery costs had increased 40% in 2 years, and where families were struggling to afford fresh vegetables. "Karen, this is a residential greenhouse for family food production. It grows vegetables so we don't have to rely completely on expensive grocery stores during supply shortages. It's actually exactly what the Extension Service recommends for Arizona families." "That's the problem," Karen shot back, warming to her prepared argument. When residents start installing commercial agricultural infrastructure, it makes the neighborhood look like we're in some kind of food crisis situation. This is a premium residential community, not a farming compound. The conversation was already surreal. Karen was calling basic food production commercial agriculture and complaining that growing your own food made our neighborhood look like we were in crisis, while grocery costs were skyrocketing and supply chains were increasingly unreliable. Besides, Karen continued, clearly building toward her main point, I've researched the regulations, and residential food production requires permits and safety inspections that you don't have. You're operating an unauthorized agricultural facility in violation of county zoning codes. This was interesting. Karen was making claims about agricultural regulations that I knew were wrong because sustainable agriculture and residential food systems were literally my job. Arizona has some of the most supportive residential growing laws in the country, specifically because of our challenging climate conditions. Karen, residential greenhouse operations under commercial thresholds don't require agricultural permits in Arizona. The state actually encourages them through extension programs and food security initiatives. Well, that's not what I was told, Karen replied, though her tone suggested less confidence than before. And regardless of permits, the HOA has standards about residential appearance that your industrial equipment clearly violates. Did you speak with someone at the county extension office who specifically handles residential agriculture? Or did you talk to general staff who might not be familiar with food production regulations? Karen's pause suggested she'd done exactly what I suspected, called random county offices without talking to anyone who actually understood agricultural policy or food security programs. The main issue, she continued, avoiding my question about her research, is that your agricultural operation creates unfair advantages that affect community property values and aesthetic standards. When some residents start operating food production facilities, it puts pressure on others to compete or creates anxiety about neighborhood commercial activity. This statement was so wrong it was almost educational. Residential food production actually increases property values by providing food security, reducing utility costs, and demonstrating sustainable living practices. It's literally the opposite of what Karen was claiming. Karen, growing your own food increases property values by providing food security and demonstrating sustainable practices. It actually makes communities more attractive to families who want food independence. That sounds like agricultural theory, Karen dismissed, but the practical reality is that your greenhouse makes neighbors feel like they need to compete for food production or worry about industrial activity in residential areas. It creates anxiety about food availability that affects everyone's quality of life. I realized that Karen's opposition wasn't based on regulations or community impact. It was based on her fundamental discomfort with visible reminders that food security wasn't guaranteed and that families might need to take responsibility for their own nutrition during supply disruptions. Besides, Karen added, clearly preparing her closing argument, premium residential communities should rely on professional landscaping and commercial food systems, not individual survival preparations that make neighborhoods look unstable. Karen had made her position clear. She opposed food production because it looked like preparation for problems she didn't want to acknowledge. She wanted me to remove systems that saved money and provided nutrition because they reminded her that Arizona was experiencing serious climate challenges that affected food security. I made a decision that would prove crucial in everything that followed. Karen, I understand your aesthetic concerns, but I'm not removing food production systems that save my family money and provide nutrition during supply disruptions. If you want to file HOA complaints or county reports, that's your choice. But I'm not eliminating practical preparations for financial reasons. Karen's expression shifted from confident authority to genuine irritation. Fine, but don't expect neighborhood support when your survival farming installations start affecting everyone else's property values. And don't come asking for community help when your agricultural operations create problems for municipal systems. She marched back toward her house with that stiff-backed walk that suggested I'd just made a serious enemy over what she considered selfish food hoarding. That evening, over dinner with Maria and the kids, I explained Karen's visit and what it might mean for our family's relationship with the HOA. Dad, are we really running a farm? Sophia asked, having overheard enough of Karen's complaints to be concerned about our family's food production efforts. Maria, who'd been tracking our household budget and knew exactly how much the greenhouse saved us monthly, answered with the practical certainty that had made me fall in love with her 18 years earlier. Sophia, Carlos, your father's greenhouse saves our family about $400 every month on grocery costs. That's money we can use for things like your soccer registration and art supplies instead of paying inflated prices for vegetables that travel thousands of miles to reach Arizona stores. But Mrs. Martinez says we're making the neighborhood look bad, Carlos added, having apparently heard Karen's aesthetic complaints during one of her property inspection walks. Mrs. Martinez moved here from California, where food costs are different and climate challenges aren't as severe, I explained. She doesn't understand that in Arizona, food production isn't about looking bad. It's about practical adaptation to extreme heat and rising grocery costs. The conversation reminded me why I'd built the greenhouse in the first place. This wasn't about preparing for apocalypse scenarios. It was about practical family budgeting during a time when basic nutrition was becoming increasingly expensive for working families. Over the following weeks, Karen's campaign against my food production escalated with the systematic determination of someone who'd decided that eliminating visible agricultural preparations was essential to maintaining community property values. She organized what she called residential standards meetings at her house, where she presented research about property values, commercial zoning violations, and the psychological effects of survival mentality on neighborhood stability. I wasn't invited to these meetings, but several neighbors mentioned that Karen was building support for HOA restrictions on individual food production. She began distributing flyers throughout the neighborhood, explaining why residential agriculture was unnecessary and potentially harmful to community aesthetic standards. The flyers included selected quotes from municipal studies, carefully edited to support her argument that individual food production could actually decrease property values through commercial appearance. Most concerning, Karen started contacting my kids' friends' parents, expressing concerns about the anxiety that our food security preparations might be causing neighborhood children. She apparently believed that visible agriculture made kids unnecessarily worried about food availability. But Karen's most serious escalation came when she filed formal complaints with the county planning office and the state agricultural department, claiming that our greenhouse violated multiple zoning codes and agricultural regulations. I received official notices requiring me to appear at county planning meetings to address complaints about unpermitted commercial agriculture and non-compliance with residential zoning. Karen had forced me to defend basic food production through official bureaucratic channels. The planning meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in the county government building. I took time off work to attend, bringing documentation showing that our greenhouse met all state agricultural guidelines and actually supported extension service food security goals. Karen arrived at the meeting with printed research and what appeared to be prepared statements about the dangers of residential agricultural operations. She'd clearly invested significant time in building her case against food production. The meeting was chaired by Tom Rodriguez, the county agricultural zoning coordinator, who I knew professionally through my extension service work. Tom had been dealing with Arizona agricultural policy for over 15 years, and he understood food security better than most municipal officials. Mrs. Martinez, Tom began, you filed complaints about residential food production by your neighbor, Mr. Park. Can you explain your specific concerns about zoning compliance? Karen launched into a detailed presentation about how individual food production could disrupt residential zoning, create commercial activity in neighborhoods, and violate community standards for residential appearance and property values. Her research was thorough, but it was based on fundamental misunderstandings about Arizona agricultural law and the difference between commercial farming operations and residential food security systems. She'd found legitimate concerns about large-scale agricultural development, but she'd applied those concerns to food production practices that were specifically encouraged by state policy. When Karen finished her presentation, Tom turned to me with the professional courtesy that one agricultural professional extends to another. David, you want to respond to these concerns? I presented my extension service credentials, greenhouse documentation, and data showing that our food production reduced grocery costs while meeting all state agricultural guidelines. The system included climate control, water conservation, and safety protocols that exceeded recommended standards for residential growing operations. More importantly, I had documentation from the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension showing that residential greenhouse operations were explicitly encouraged under current food security policies, and that our system represented exactly the kind of individual agriculture that helped communities manage climate challenges and supply disruptions. Tom, I concluded, Mrs. Martinez raises valid concerns about improperly managed agricultural operations, but our greenhouse meets state food production standards and actually supports community food security goals rather than undermining residential zoning. Tom reviewed my documentation with the expertise of someone who dealt with agricultural zoning issues daily. Mrs. Martinez, he said finally, Mr. Park's greenhouse appears to meet state agricultural guidelines and county zoning requirements. Residential food production is explicitly encouraged under current food security policies. Karen's face showed several emotions as she realized her regulatory challenge had failed. But what about community aesthetics and property values? She pressed. What about the psychological impact of making neighbors feel like they're living in agricultural areas instead of residential neighborhoods? Ma'am, county regulations don't restrict food production based on aesthetic preferences. If Mr. Park's system meets safety and agricultural requirements, community appearance concerns are outside our zoning authority. The meeting ended with Karen's complaints dismissed and my food production officially validated by County Agricultural Review. But I knew this wouldn't be the end of Karen's campaign against what she saw as unnecessary survival preparations. Over the following month, Karen's efforts intensified as Arizona climate conditions worsened and temperatures began reaching levels that made traditional outdoor gardening completely impossible throughout our region. She organized a neighborhood petition claiming that individual food production created unfair resource distribution and requesting voluntary removal of agricultural systems for community aesthetics. The petition gained some signatures from neighbors who'd been convinced by Karen's arguments about commercial appearance and residential standards. She contacted local landscaping companies, asking them to assess whether residential greenhouses interfered with professional landscape design and community property values. Several companies, apparently influenced by Karen's presentation about competing food systems, suggested that individual agriculture might complicate their commercial landscaping services. Most troubling, Karen began spreading rumors that residential food production could void homeowners' insurance due to unauthorized agricultural operations, and that families with greenhouses might face liability issues if zoning violations developed. But what I didn't know was that Karen's campaign against food production was connected to a much more serious problem that would soon expose her real motivations for opposing individual food security. During this same period, I'd been noticing irregularities in neighborhood landscaping contracts that didn't match normal pricing patterns. Several neighbors mentioned unusually high landscaping costs, and the community beautification seemed inconsistent with actual maintenance work being performed. As an Extension Service agricultural specialist, I had access to regional agricultural databases that showed landscaping costs throughout Arizona communities. When I ran analysis on our neighborhood's beautification expenses versus actual maintenance work, the numbers didn't add up. Our community was being charged for significantly more landscaping services than municipal records showed we were receiving. Someone was inflating maintenance costs and pocketing the difference, a scheme that could only work if residents weren't developing their own landscaping expertise or questioning professional service charges. The person running this landscaping fraud needed neighbors who weren't monitoring beautification costs, who weren't developing gardening skills, and who weren't questioning unusually high professional service bills. Karen's campaign against food production wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about maintaining the conditions that allowed her landscaping manipulation to continue undetected. That's when the heat wave hit with full force, and Karen's world started falling apart in ways she never saw coming. The extreme heat wave that struck Arizona in midsummer created temperatures that exposed both Karen's landscaping fraud and the critical importance of the food production systems she'd been trying to eliminate. Record temperatures reached 118 degrees Fahrenheit for 6 consecutive days, with nighttime temperatures staying above 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Traditional outdoor gardening became completely impossible, and even professional landscaping required massive water usage and cooling systems that drove maintenance costs to unsustainable levels. For families with climate-controlled growing systems, these temperatures were manageable. Our greenhouse maintained optimal growing conditions regardless of external temperatures, and our food production continued without interruption or additional costs. But for families like Karen's, who'd relied entirely on professional landscaping and commercial food systems, the heat wave created immediate crisis conditions. Karen's landscaping bills skyrocketed to over $800 per month as professional services struggled to maintain traditional gardens during extreme heat. Her property began showing heat damage despite expensive cooling systems, and her monthly beautification costs jumped to levels that strained even her landscape consulting income. More importantly, the heat wave exposed Karen's landscaping manipulation scheme when community auditors began investigating maintenance cost discrepancies throughout our region. State agricultural investigators discovered that Karen had been inflating neighborhood landscaping bills by reporting false maintenance work to community beautification budgets and pocketing the difference through shell companies she controlled. The scheme had been generating nearly $75,000 annually in fraudulent billing throughout our community. The investigation revealed that Karen's opposition to food production wasn't about aesthetics or community standards. It was about preventing residents from developing agricultural knowledge and discovering her landscaping fraud. When families develop food production expertise, they notice discrepancies between actual maintenance needs and professional service billing. Karen's fraud could only continue if neighbors remained dependent on professional services and unaware of actual landscaping costs. The first sign that Karen's world was collapsing came on a Tuesday morning when I found her standing at my front door at 6 a.m., looking genuinely panicked for the first time since I'd known her. "David," she said, her voice lacking the confident authority I'd grown accustomed to hearing, "I need to ask you about something. My landscaping costs, they're completely out of control." I looked at her standing there with papers in her hand, papers that I suspected were service bills she could no longer afford, and investigation notices she couldn't ignore. "What kind of problems are you seeing, Karen?" "My maintenance bill hit $847 last month, and this month they're saying I owe over $900, she said, her words coming quickly as if she was still processing the financial reality. "The landscaping companies are threatening to stop service if I don't pay, but I can't afford these amounts. I don't understand how plant maintenance can cost this much." I could see the weight of multiple crises converging in her expression. The realization that her landscaping bills were unaffordable, that her property was suffering heat damage despite expensive professional services, and that the food production systems she'd opposed were the only thing keeping other families from facing similar disaster. "How much maintenance work are you actually getting for those monthly costs?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would reveal the full scope of her problems. "I don't know," Karen replied. "I never tracked actual maintenance before. I just paid whatever the companies said I owed. But now, with the extreme heat and these massive costs, I can't keep up with payments." This was the moment when 8 months of opposing food production collided with the reality of Arizona climate economics and Karen's own landscaping fraud being investigated by state authorities. "Karen," I said gently, "I think we need to look at your actual maintenance needs versus what you're being charged and figure out how to implement growing systems that can handle extreme heat without massive professional service costs." What we discovered during that review was a family crisis created by both climate conditions and Karen's own fraudulent billing practices coming back to destroy her finances. Karen's landscaping bills showed maintenance work that was physically impossible during extreme heat conditions, evidence of the billing manipulation that was now being investigated by state agricultural fraud investigators. She'd been inflating her own bills along with everyone else's, but she'd also been spending the fraudulent proceeds on maintaining unsustainable landscaping that required massive professional services. When temperatures reached record levels, Karen couldn't maintain her heat-sensitive landscaping without professional services that cost thousands monthly. Her landscape consulting business was failing as clients discovered her fraudulent billing, while her personal property required expensive maintenance she could no longer afford. Most critically, Karen had no food production infrastructure to help manage grocery costs during the supply disruptions that extreme heat created throughout Arizona. "I don't understand how this happened," Karen said, as we reviewed her billing and maintenance data. "I was trying to maintain community standards and prevent agricultural appearance, but now I'm the one facing financial crisis from landscaping costs." "Karen, the food production systems you opposed weren't about agricultural appearance. They were about practical preparation for exactly the climate conditions we're facing now. Extreme heat isn't a crisis you can prevent through aesthetic standards. It's a climate challenge you manage through adaptation and preparation." Over the following weeks, as Karen's legal troubles intensified and her financial situation deteriorated, she began to understand the connections between food security, climate adaptation, and community resilience during challenging conditions. The state agricultural fraud investigation resulted in criminal charges against Karen for billing manipulation, restitution requirements exceeding $125,000, and immediate termination from her HOA position. Her landscape consulting license was suspended pending resolution of fraud charges. But perhaps most importantly for our neighborhood, Karen's legal troubles led to comprehensive landscaping billing audits that corrected fraudulent charges and reduced maintenance costs for every family in our community. The corrected billing, combined with climate adaptation policies that encourage food production, created financial incentives for residents to implement exactly the growing systems that Karen had spent months opposing. 6 months after her arrest, Karen contacted me requesting help with installing greenhouse and food production systems for her property. The financial necessity of climate adaptation had overcome her aesthetic objections to visible agricultural infrastructure. "David," she said during our conversation about installing food production at her house, "I want you to know that I was completely wrong about food production and its importance for family financial security. I didn't understand that agricultural adaptation isn't about survival mentality. It's about practical preparation for predictable climate challenges." The installation of Karen's greenhouse system became a neighborhood education opportunity, demonstrating how climate-controlled growing, heat-resistant crops, and water conservation could reduce food costs while supporting community food security goals. But perhaps the most meaningful change came when Karen began advocating for food production education and community agricultural resilience throughout our region. I learned through financial crisis and legal consequences, Karen would tell audiences of homeowners and HOA boards that opposing practical food production because it looks like agricultural activity can create actual crisis when climate challenges arrive. Food security isn't about fear. It's about responsible preparation and community resilience. Today, our neighborhood has become a model for suburban food production and climate adaptation in Arizona. Most homes have some form of controlled growing environment, and the Community Association provides education about heat-resistant techniques and financial benefits of food security. Karen Martinez serves as a volunteer coordinator for the Desert Vista Food Security Project, working with county extension offices and state agricultural departments to help families implement growing systems and avoid the financial crisis she experienced. The transformation has been remarkable. From a community that opposed food production as unnecessary agricultural activity to a neighborhood that's become a regional example of how suburban residents can achieve food security while reducing grocery costs during climate emergencies. But the long-term impact of Karen's fraud case and our neighborhood's transformation extended far beyond Desert Vista. The investigation led to statewide policy changes regarding community service billing, oversight, and residential agricultural support. The Arizona Corporation Commission used our case as the foundation for the Community Service Transparency Act, legislation that required independent auditing of neighborhood service billing and created protection mechanisms for communities targeted by maintenance fraud schemes. I was invited to testify before the Arizona legislature during consideration of the Community Service Transparency Act, representing families who had discovered billing fraud through agricultural monitoring and food production expertise. Karen's fraud scheme succeeded for 2 years because residents weren't monitoring their actual maintenance needs, I told the legislative committee. When families develop food production expertise, they become naturally aware of landscaping requirements that make billing fraud detectable. Agricultural education isn't just about food security, it's about financial protection for residential communities. The legislation passed with bipartisan support and became a model for similar laws in other climate-challenged states throughout the Southwest. Federal agricultural agencies began promoting residential growing education as essential infrastructure for both food security and fraud prevention. Karen's transformation during this period became equally comprehensive. While serving her community service sentence for maintenance fraud, she completed certification as a sustainable agriculture specialist through the extension program. I have unique credibility when I talk to communities about the importance of agricultural monitoring, Karen explained during one of her educational presentations. I can honestly say that I was wrong about food production being unnecessary, and I can show exactly how opposing practical agricultural adaptation can create the conditions that allow fraud and financial crisis to develop. Her presentations included detailed case studies of our neighborhood's billing fraud, showing how food production expertise had exposed the scheme and protected families from continued financial exploitation. The before and after financial analysis provided compelling evidence that agricultural education created economic benefits beyond simple grocery savings. Karen also worked with law enforcement agencies throughout Arizona to develop fraud prevention education programs, helping communities recognize billing irregularities and implement monitoring systems that could detect service fraud before it caused serious financial damage. 3 years after her conviction, Karen completed her community service requirements and began working as a paid consultant for sustainable agriculture education programs throughout the Southwest. Her personal experience with both fraud and financial crisis made her an effective advocate for practical food security. My billing fraud cost families in our community over $200,000 in false charges, Karen would tell audiences of municipal officials and community leaders. But the food production systems I opposed would have exposed my scheme within months if residents had been developing agricultural expertise. Communities that implement growing education protect themselves from both climate challenges and financial fraud. 5 years after the heat wave and fraud investigation, Desert Vista hosted the first annual Arizona Community Food Security Conference, bringing together agricultural professionals, climate adaptation educators, and community advocates from throughout the state. The conference featured presentations on residential growing technology, billing fraud prevention, and community resilience during extreme weather conditions. But the most powerful sessions came from families who had experienced both climate challenges and financial fraud, providing firsthand accounts of how food production and agricultural monitoring could protect communities from multiple threats. Sophia and Carlos, now 18 and 15, participated in the conference as youth advocates for agricultural education and financial literacy. Their presentation, titled "Growing Up Food Secure: How Agricultural Awareness Shapes Community Responsibility," addressed the educational benefits that children experience when families prioritize practical food production. Living through our neighborhood's heat wave and fraud crisis taught us that food production isn't about restriction or fear, Sophia told the conference audience. It's about understanding how agricultural systems work, so families can make informed decisions that protect both food security and financial stability. Carlos added, "When communities develop growing expertise and understand their actual food needs, they become resistant to both climate challenges and economic exploitation. Agricultural education creates informed citizens who can protect themselves and their neighbors from multiple threats." The conference concluded with the announcement of the Arizona Community Agricultural Resilience Institute, a joint project between the State Extension Service, University of Arizona, agricultural programs, and community food security organizations. The institute would develop improved growing technologies while documenting best practices for community-wide food production and fraud prevention. I was appointed as the institute's founding research director, a position that allowed me to expand community agricultural research beyond Arizona to climate-challenged regions throughout the southwestern United States. The Institute's first major project involved documenting community resilience during the Desert Vista heat wave and fraud crisis, plus similar challenges in other residential areas that had experienced both climate emergencies and financial exploitation. The research confirmed that agricultural education could improve community resilience by 70 to 85% compared to areas that relied solely on professional services without resident expertise. More importantly, the research demonstrated that communities with active food production programs showed significantly lower rates of service fraud, climate vulnerability, and economic instability during extreme weather events. The Institute also developed standardized guidelines for residential growing systems, making effective food production more accessible to families without advanced agricultural knowledge. The guidelines included detailed specifications for different climate regions, growing technologies, and community coordination systems. But perhaps the most significant research finding involved the educational and community benefits of agricultural awareness. Families with food production systems showed increased understanding of natural cycles, greater community engagement during challenges, and improved financial literacy regarding food costs and agricultural economics. Today, 10 years after Karen's fraud conviction and our heat wave crisis, over 80% of Arizona's suburban communities have some form of resident-supported food production program. Property values in agriculturally conscious neighborhoods significantly exceed values in areas that rely solely on professional services without resident involvement. The transformation has been so comprehensive that new residents moving to Arizona communities routinely ask about food production programs and agricultural education opportunities during home purchasing decisions. Real estate agents now market community growing infrastructure as premium features that provide both food security and financial protection. Sophia and Carlos, now working as agricultural consultants specializing in community food production, credit their experience with our neighborhood's crisis for shaping their professional dedication to agricultural education and climate resilience. Growing up during extreme heat and fraud taught us that climate challenges and financial threats often occur simultaneously. Sophia explained during a recent interview about her work developing community growing programs. Agricultural education helps communities prepare for both environmental and economic challenges rather than addressing them separately. Carlos, who specializes in residential growing technology and fraud prevention systems, added, "Our neighborhood's experience showed that practical food production and financial protection aren't separate concerns. They're integrated approaches to community resilience that protect families from multiple threats." Karen Martinez, now 58 and recognized as one of Arizona's leading sustainable agriculture educators, frequently speaks about the connections between food production, financial security, and community fraud prevention. I learned through personal crisis and legal consequences that opposing practical agriculture creates vulnerability to both climate challenges and economic exploitation. She tells audiences of community leaders, municipal officials, and agricultural advocates. Food security education isn't about fear or restriction. It's about creating informed communities that can protect themselves from predictable threats. Her presentations always include the fundamental lesson that our neighborhood's crisis taught everyone involved. Food production and financial monitoring aren't separate activities. They're complementary approaches to community security that protect families from both climate challenges and economic fraud that often target the same vulnerable populations. But the most profound impact has been on how Arizona approaches community resilience education and agricultural security planning. The Desert Vista case study is now required curriculum in municipal management programs throughout the state, teaching future city planners and community leaders about the connections between agricultural education, fraud prevention, and economic security. The Arizona Department of Agriculture has established the Community Food Resilience Initiative, a $75 million program that provides funding and technical assistance for residential growing programs, billing monitoring systems, and community education projects throughout the state. I've been serving as the initiative's technical advisor, helping communities implement food production programs that provide both nutritional benefits and economic protection from service fraud and supply disruptions. The initiative has supported over 400 communities in developing integrated growing and monitoring programs, with documented results showing average household savings of $350 monthly on food costs, plus protection from billing fraud schemes that had been targeting communities without active agricultural monitoring. More importantly, Communities participating in the initiative show significantly higher levels of civic engagement, community cooperation, and economic resilience during both climate challenges and economic downturns. Maria, who has been working as a financial consultant specializing in household food budgeting, credits our family's experience with food production for shaping her understanding of how agricultural awareness affects family financial security. David's greenhouse didn't just save us money on grocery bills, she explains to families seeking financial counseling. It taught our entire family that food awareness and financial planning are connected skills that create economic security rather than separate concerns that compete for attention. Maria's practice now specializes in helping families implement food production as part of comprehensive financial planning, showing clients how agricultural investments provide both nutritional benefits and economic protection that traditional financial instruments can't offer. The long-term economic data from our neighborhood supports Maria's approach. Families who implemented growing systems before the heat wave and fraud crisis showed 50% less financial stress during climate emergencies, 70% lower food costs during supply disruptions, and significantly higher long-term savings rates compared to families who relied solely on traditional financial planning without agricultural consideration. Sophia and Carlos have taken their childhood experience with agricultural education and applied it to their adult careers in ways that continue expanding the impact of food awareness throughout Arizona and beyond. Sophia's agricultural consulting firm specializes in helping communities develop food production education programs that integrate climate adaptation with economic security and fraud prevention. Her work has influenced agricultural policy in 15 states and 4 countries. Our childhood experience with extreme heat and fraud taught me that climate challenges and economic threats often target the same vulnerable populations, Sophia says. Effective agricultural education must address both environmental resilience and economic protection to create truly sustainable communities. Carlos's technology company develops software systems that help communities monitor food production efficiency and detect service billing irregularities before they become major fraud schemes. His monitoring systems are now used by over 600 communities throughout the western United States. The billing fraud that targeted our neighborhood succeeded because residents weren't monitoring their actual agricultural needs, Carlos explains. Technology can make food production monitoring as simple as checking your bank account, giving families the information they need to protect themselves from both climate challenges and economic fraud. The software Carlos developed provides real-time growing analysis, cost verification, and production optimization that helps families reduce food expenses while detecting potential fraud before it creates serious financial damage. But perhaps the most meaningful validation of our family's approach to food security came 7 years ago, when the Arizona Governor's Office recognized Desert Vista as the state's model community for integrated agricultural resilience and economic protection. Governor Chen visited our neighborhood during the recognition ceremony, touring growing installations and meeting with families who had benefited from both food security and fraud prevention programs. What happened in Desert Vista represents the future of community resilience, Governor Chen said during her visit. When residents understand agricultural production and monitor their food costs, they create communities that are resistant to both climate challenges and economic exploitation. This is how Arizona communities can thrive during uncertain times. The governor's recognition led to increased state funding for community agricultural programs and federal attention to Arizona's integrated approach to food security and fraud prevention. Our neighborhood has hosted delegations from municipal leaders throughout the United States and internationally, with visitors studying how agricultural education can create both nutritional benefits and economic protection for residential communities. The most frequent question from visiting delegations involves the connection between food production awareness and fraud prevention. Many communities struggle with service fraud, but hadn't considered how agricultural education could provide protection from economic exploitation. Growing expertise gives residents the information they need to verify service billing accuracy, I explained to visiting officials. When families understand their actual food production needs, they become naturally resistant to billing fraud and other forms of service exploitation. The international attention has led to collaboration with communities in Australia, Israel, and other countries that face similar challenges with extreme heat and service fraud targeting residential areas. Our neighborhood's transformation from opposing food production as unnecessary to becoming a global model for agricultural resilience demonstrates that practical education and community cooperation can address multiple challenges simultaneously rather than requiring separate solutions for climate and economic threats. Today, when Maria and I talk to young families about choosing homes and building financial security, we always emphasize the connections between food awareness, climate adaptation, and economic protection. Food production saved our family thousands of dollars in grocery costs, I tell them. But more importantly, it taught us that practical preparation and financial responsibility work together to create security that no single approach can provide. The greenhouse that Karen once called an industrial eyesore has become valued community infrastructure that provides both nutritional benefits and economic protection for families throughout Arizona and beyond. Sometimes being prepared really isn't about fear or survival mentality. It's just about understanding climate realities and taking practical steps that protect your family from predictable challenges. What climate adaptation challenges is your family facing? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience could help other families understand how practical food production can provide both nutritional benefits and economic protection. If this video opened your eyes to connections between agricultural awareness and financial security, remember that food production education benefits entire communities rather than just individual households. And if you love seeing justice served when practical preparation beats aesthetic obsession, hit that subscribe button for more stories where common sense and family responsibility create better outcomes than ignoring predictable challenges. The most remarkable transformation occurred 15 years after our initial greenhouse confrontation, when Desert Vista was selected as the pilot community for the National Climate Adaptation Demonstration Project, a federal initiative showcasing how residential communities can maintain food security and economic stability during increasingly severe weather events. The selection committee, composed of representatives from the Department of Agriculture, FEMA, and the National Weather Service, cited our neighborhood's comprehensive integration of agricultural education, fraud prevention, and community resilience as the model for suburban climate adaptation throughout the United States. During the selection process, federal officials interviewed dozens of families who had benefited from our community's agricultural transformation, documenting how food production expertise had protected residents from both climate emergencies and economic exploitation during multiple crisis events over the past decade. Desert Vista represents the future of American suburban resilience, explained Dr. Patricia Williams, the project's federal coordinator, during the announcement ceremony. This community has demonstrated that agricultural education and economic protection aren't separate concerns. They're integrated solutions that create lasting security for families facing unpredictable challenges. The federal recognition brought additional resources to our neighborhood, including funding for expanded growing facilities, advanced climate monitoring systems, and comprehensive educational programs that would serve as templates for communities throughout the country. More importantly, the designation attracted international attention from countries facing similar challenges with extreme weather and community economic vulnerability. Delegations from Australia, Israel, Mexico, and the European Union visited Desert Vista to study our integrated approach to agricultural resilience and fraud prevention. Sophia and Carlos, now in their 20s and recognized as leading experts in community agricultural systems, were invited to present our neighborhood's transformation at the United Nations Climate Adaptation Conference in Geneva, representing grassroots community solutions to global climate challenges. What we learned growing up in Desert Vista, Sophia told the international audience, is that climate adaptation and economic security work best when communities develop expertise rather than depending entirely on external systems. Agricultural education gives families the knowledge they need to protect themselves from both environmental challenges and financial exploitation. Carlos added, "The technology solutions that emerged from our neighborhood's crisis have now helped over 1,000 communities develop integrated monitoring systems that protect families from climate emergencies, supply disruptions, and service fraud simultaneously. Local expertise creates global resilience. Their presentation documented how the agricultural monitoring systems developed in Desert Vista had been adapted for use in refugee communities, urban food deserts, and rural areas facing climate displacement, demonstrating the universal applicability of community-based food security and economic protection strategies. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came when Karen Martinez was invited to address the American Society of Agricultural Engineers annual conference, representing community advocates who had learned the importance of agricultural expertise through personal crisis and transformation. 15 years ago, I opposed food production in my neighborhood because I thought it made us look unstable, Karen told the audience of agricultural professionals. I didn't understand that agricultural stability requires preparation, not wishful thinking. My opposition to practical food security created the conditions that allowed both climate vulnerability and economic fraud to threaten families who trusted my judgment. Karen's presentation included detailed analysis of how her landscaping fraud had succeeded, precisely because residents lacked the agricultural knowledge needed to recognize billing irregularities and maintenance manipulation. The case study demonstrated how agricultural education could protect communities from multiple threats simultaneously. The most important lesson from Desert Vista, Karen concluded, is that agricultural expertise and community fraud prevention aren't separate skills. They're complementary forms of knowledge that protect families from both environmental and economic threats that often target the same vulnerable populations. The conference audience, composed of agricultural engineers, extension specialists, and community development professionals, gave Karen a standing ovation that lasted over 5 minutes, recognizing both her personal transformation and the broader implications of her experience for community resilience education. Following the conference, Karen was appointed as the national spokesperson for the Community Agricultural Resilience Initiative, a position that allowed her to share the Desert Vista model with communities throughout the United States and internationally. The long-term economic impact of our neighborhood's transformation became even more significant as climate challenges intensified throughout the Southwest, and communities without agricultural preparedness faced increasingly severe food security and financial crises. Economic analysis conducted by the University of Arizona showed that families in agricultural prepared communities like Desert Vista experienced 60 to 80% less financial stress during climate emergencies compared to communities that relied solely on external food systems and professional services without resident expertise. More importantly, the analysis demonstrated that community agricultural education created economic benefits that extended far beyond simple cost savings, including increased property values, reduced insurance premiums, and enhanced community cooperation that attracted businesses and investment to resilient neighborhoods. Property values in Desert Vista had increased 40% above regional averages, with real estate agents specifically marketing our community's agricultural infrastructure and climate adaptation expertise as premium features that provided both lifestyle benefits and economic protection. The transformation attracted young families seeking communities that prioritized practical education and economic resilience, creating a demographic shift toward residents who valued agricultural knowledge and community cooperation over purely aesthetic considerations. But the most profound long-term impact occurred when our neighborhood's children, who had grown up understanding agricultural systems and climate adaptation, began pursuing careers that extended Desert Vista's influence throughout the region and beyond. Besides Sophia and Carlos, 12 other young adults from our community had chosen careers in agricultural engineering, community development, climate adaptation, or fraud prevention, creating a professional network that continued expanding the Desert Vista model throughout the southwestern United States. These professionals, who had experienced firsthand the benefits of community agricultural education and economic protection, brought unique perspectives to their work that emphasized practical solutions over theoretical approaches and community expertise over external dependency. Their influence extended the Desert Vista model to over 200 communities throughout Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and California, with each adaptation reflecting local climate conditions while maintaining the core principles of agricultural education, economic monitoring, and community resilience. Maria and I, now in our 50s, continued working to expand agricultural education and financial literacy throughout the region. But our focus had shifted toward developing programs that could be implemented by communities without requiring specialized expertise or significant financial investment. The most important lesson we learned, Maria explained during a recent interview about sustainable community development, is that agricultural resilience doesn't require advanced technology or expensive infrastructure. It requires education, cooperation, and willingness to take responsibility for community food security rather than depending entirely on external systems. I added, "What happened in Desert Vista demonstrates that communities can address climate challenges and economic vulnerability simultaneously when residents develop practical expertise and work together to protect shared interests rather than competing for individual advantages." Our work had evolved to focus on developing simplified agricultural education programs that could be implemented by any community regardless of climate conditions, economic resources, or existing expertise, making the Desert Vista model accessible to families and neighborhoods throughout the country. The simplified programs included basic growing techniques, financial monitoring systems, and community coordination protocols that could be adapted for different regions while maintaining the essential elements that had made our neighborhood successful. But perhaps the most significant validation of our approach came when the Federal Emergency Management Agency incorporated community agricultural education into their official disaster preparedness guidelines, recognizing food production expertise as essential infrastructure for community resilience during climate emergencies. The FEMA guidelines, developed in consultation with agricultural professionals from Desert Vista and similar communities, established agricultural education as a priority for federal disaster preparedness funding and community resilience planning. Communities with active food production programs show significantly better outcomes during climate emergencies, the guidelines stated. Agricultural education helps residents maintain nutrition and economic stability when external food systems are disrupted by extreme weather events. The federal recognition meant that communities throughout the United States could access funding and technical assistance for implementing agricultural education programs based on the Desert Vista model, expanding our neighborhood's influence to a national scale. Today, 20 years after Karen's initial opposition to my greenhouse, the agricultural education principles that emerged from our neighborhood crisis have been implemented in over 2,000 communities throughout the United States and 15 countries internationally. The Desert Vista model has been adapted for urban communities, rural areas, military installations, and refugee settlements, demonstrating the universal applicability of community-based agricultural education and economic protection strategies. More importantly, the communities that have implemented these programs show consistently better outcomes during climate emergencies, economic disruptions, and public health crises, with residents who understand agricultural systems proving more resilient during multiple types of challenges. The greenhouse that Karen once called an industrial eyesore has become the symbol of a global movement toward community agricultural resilience and economic protection that continues growing stronger with each new community that chooses practical preparation over wishful thinking. When families ask Maria and me about the most important lesson from our experience with neighborhood conflict and community transformation, we always emphasize that agricultural education and economic protection work best when they're shared rather than individual efforts. Our greenhouse didn't just save our family, we tell them. It became the foundation for community resilience that protects everyone when challenges arrive. The most powerful form of preparation is education that creates community expertise rather than individual stockpiling. Sometimes standing up to neighborhood tyrants doesn't just save yourself. It creates lasting change that protects entire communities from both climate vulnerability and economic exploitation for generations to come. What's your worst HOA horror story? Drop it in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else going through the same battle. Hit that subscribe button if you love seeing bullies get what they deserve, and ring that notification bell for more HOA Revenge Stories, where justice is served ice cold. Remember, when good people refuse to be intimidated by fake authority and work together to develop practical solutions, they can build communities that thrive during uncertain times rather than simply surviving them. Thanks for watching HOA Revenge Stories, where we prove that every HOA Karen eventually meets their match, and sometimes that match changes the world.